The Redoutable-class submarines, with a displacement of over 1,650 long tons, became the backbone of the French fleet. In total, 31 of these ocean-going submarines were built between 1925 and 1937. They were commissioned throughout the 1930s. These boats were known for their high endurance and versatility. During the interwar period, they were the largest class of submarines in France, and by 1940, they made up about 40% of the country's entire submarine fleet. This class was ordered under the 1925 rearmament program to modernize the submarine forces after the Washington Naval Treaty. The 1922 treaty limited the surface fleet but barely affected submarines, thanks to diplomatic agreements with Britain. After World War I, the military budget was tight, while tensions in Europe and the colonies were rising. Because of this, France focused on the cost-effective construction of submarines for defense and deterrence. This program marked the transition from experimental prototypes built before 1914 to standardized production. In addition to ocean-going boats, France built smaller coastal classes and the unique submarine cruiser Surcouf. The design was heavily influenced by the experience of World War I. At that time, French submarines performed well in coastal waters, but were outmatched in the open ocean by captured German Type UB-3 and Type UC-3 U-boats, which France received as reparations. Engineers lengthened the hull of the previous Requin class to increase power and range. The main goals were long patrols for intercepting merchant ships, reconnaissance, and protecting overseas territories like Indochina, Dakar, and Madagascar. This focus on colonial defense and expanding their operational area in the ocean reflected France's desire to maintain a global naval presence, even with limited resources. This family of submarines was divided into two similar groups, specifically the early Type M5 and the more numerous Type M6, which included the boat Fresnel. The M6 models had the same dimensions and missions, but received more powerful engines, producing 6,000 horsepower for surfaced operations. Although the submarines were built at various state arsenals and private shipyards, standardization greatly simplified their maintenance. It was easier for the naval forces to organize units, train crews, and supply spare parts, since operating the boats was practically identical. This versatility had strategic importance, as these submarines could be deployed from European bases thousands of miles from home. The submarine Fresnel belonged to the M6 series and was named after the physicist Augustin Jean Fresnel. Her home port was the city of Brest. The boat was ordered under the same 1925 program. She was laid down on July 7, 1927, at the shipyard in Saint-Nazaire, France. Construction followed the M6 variant design, which featured a double hull for better seaworthiness and greater cruising range. The submarine was launched on June 8, 1929, marking the completion of her basic hull assembly. After the launch, Fresnel was fitted out at the Brest Naval Base. This is where her systems were integrated and her propulsion machinery and armament were installed. This prepared the submarine for preliminary trials, with arming beginning on August 15, 1929. A major setback happened during engine trials on April 28, 1930, at Brest. While reversing, the rear diving plane's control system failed. The planes inverted, which damaged the propellers and caused severe harm to the diesel engines. Crews quickly made repairs at Brest, fixing the structural and mechanical issues so trials could resume. After repairs, official trials were successful, proving the submarine was seaworthy and performed well. Fresnel was commissioned into service on February 22, 1932. She was first assigned to the 3rd Submarine Division based at Toulon, joining the underwater forces of the Mediterranean Fleet. The French submarine Fresnel was part of the Redoutable-class. She featured a streamlined double-hull design optimized for long-range oceanic patrols. She measured 303 feet in length, 27 feet in beam, and had a draft of 15 feet when surfaced. These proportions helped classify her as a fleet submarine, balancing maneuverability with the endurance needed for long missions in contested waters. Her surface displacement was 1,545 long tons and 2,051 long tons when submerged. This accounted for the heavy ballast and battery systems required for underwater operations. Two Sulzer diesel engines provided 6,000 horsepower for surface travel. For submerged propulsion, two Schneider electric motors produced 2,000 horsepower, driving twin screws. This setup allowed Fresnel to reach a surfaced speed of 17.5 knots and a submerged speed of 10 knots. During some trials, she even hit a surfaced speed of 18.6 knots under ideal conditions. The diesel-electric configuration focused on reliability rather than raw power, allowing for long surface transits while keeping noise to a minimum during dives. However, the machinery came with tactical limitations. Assessments of these 1,500-ton submarines noted that the diesel engines, electric machinery, and diving plane mechanisms could be noisy. Their detection equipment was less advanced than their speed and weapons. Because of this, watchkeepers, periscopes, and visual observation were crucial for finding targets and avoiding danger. Hydrophones helped while submerged, but they did not provide the clear, broad underwater picture seen with later wartime sonar systems. Fresnel was powerful and had great range for the interwar period, but successful operations still relied heavily on disciplined lookouts, careful navigation, and the commander's judgment. Operational range was a major strength. Fresnel could travel 14,000 nautical miles at 7 knots when surfaced, or 10,000 nautical miles at 10 knots, thanks to large fuel reserves. While submerged, her endurance reached 90 nautical miles at 7 knots. Her rated test depth was 262 feet. This gave her enough operating room to use evasion tactics without risking structural damage. These capabilities highlighted her role in strategic deterrence and reconnaissance during the interwar years and the early days of World War II. Under normal conditions, periscope depth was about 50 feet, and standard diving depth was 260 feet. However, a few submarines of this class proved during trials that their pressure hulls could withstand much greater depths. A crash dive took between 30 and 40 seconds. This was an important defensive feature for a large boat that spent most of its transit surfaced. The submarines had 3 periscopes, an attack periscope, an anti-aircraft periscope, and a spare periscope, along with hydrophones for listening underwater. 2 antennas were used for radio communication. One was strung low along the hull, and the other, a higher one, was positioned between telescopic masts, allowing the submarine to maintain long-distance communication under favorable conditions. The armament of the French submarine Fresnel was standard for the Redoutable-class. The main focus was on versatility for attacking ships during long ocean patrols. The boat had 11 torpedo tubes positioned to provide powerful salvos and tactical flexibility. In the bow were 4 fixed 21.6-inch torpedo tubes with a total supply of 6 torpedoes. Behind the conning tower sat a triple traversing mount of the same caliber with no spare torpedoes. At the stern was a twin traversing mount, also without reloads, and 2 additional 15.7-inch tubes. These were designed specifically for attacking merchant ships with smaller warheads. In total, Fresnel carried 13 French-made torpedoes. The larger 1924 model torpedoes had a 683-pound warhead and could hit targets over 4 nautical miles away at a speed of 35 knots. The smaller 1926 model torpedoes carried 317 pounds of explosives and had a range of nearly 2 nautical miles at the same speed. External traversing mounts were a signature feature of French submarines from the interwar period. They could be aimed independently, but could only be reloaded while surfaced, which limited the capabilities of the boat during a prolonged submerged engagement. According to French doctrine, the torpedo caliber was chosen based on the target. Heavy torpedoes were saved for large warships and massive merchant vessels, while lighter ones were a cheaper option for smaller targets. All torpedoes ran on compressed air and left a noticeable wake of bubbles and exhaust gases on the surface. This wake created a serious tactical problem. An observant enemy could spot it in time and evade, while escort ships could trace the line back to the firing point and launch a search using depth charges. Therefore, the commander of Fresnel had to carefully calculate the range, firing angle, target speed, and the time needed to withdraw after launch. For surface combat and defense, Fresnel had a single 4-inch deck gun mounted in the bow. It was a modern weapon for its time, weighing 11 tons, which fired up to 10 rounds per minute and could elevate to 70 degrees. The gun fired 54-pound high-explosive shells that traveled at a speed of nearly 2,500 feet per second. It provided solid support against escorts or coastal targets while transiting to patrol zones. Anti-aircraft defense was modest and consisted of twin half-inch heavy machine guns. They sat on a platform behind the conning tower, offering light protection against aerial reconnaissance, which was a typical weak point for surface submarines of that era. The boat carried no mine-laying or additional equipment, since the designers focused entirely on torpedo attacks. The crew of the submarine Fresnel consisted of 73 men. This included 5 officers, a number that increased to 6 during combat patrols, and 68 enlisted sailors. This setup was perfectly suited for stealth patrols. The officers handled navigation, tactics, and engineering systems, while the enlisted specialists took care of loading torpedoes, maintaining the engines, operating the hydrophones, and damage control. The small crew was the result of a smart design for this class, allowing them to carry out missions lasting anywhere from 30 to 45 days. The boat took on 72 short tons of fuel and a limited supply of fresh water, though living conditions were tough because of the double-hull design and external fuel tanks. To reduce risks in such a cramped space, where losing just one specialist could disrupt several systems, the sailors cross-trained in related roles. The exact same crew structure was used on the sister submarines Ajax and Casabianca, making it easy to transfer personnel from one vessel to another. Great endurance did not mean great comfort. On these submarines, displacing 1,653 tons, there simply weren't enough bunks for everyone. So sailors slept in shifts, with those coming off watch freeing up bunks for those going on. Space for fresh food was scarce, and ventilation steadily got worse during long periods submerged with the hatches sealed. The heat from the machinery, battery fumes, the smell of diesel fuel, condensation, and the constant movement of people in the cramped compartments led to severe fatigue. That's why long-range patrols were planned not just to test the engines and cruising range, but also to see how the crew handled weeks of monotonous watches, equipment maintenance, and life in a confined space. Throughout her entire service, the Fresnel did not undergo any major weapons upgrades or changes in crew structure. The vessel kept her original 1932 configuration despite wartime demands. Minor tweaks, like redistributing ammunition, obviously happened, but they weren't documented. This proves the reliability of the M6 series, even though by 1939, this submarine was already falling behind Allied boats in anti-aircraft defense. The armament was quite powerful. The bow housed 4 fixed 21.7-inch torpedo tubes with reloading capabilities. Amidships, there were 3 trainable tubes of the same caliber and 2 more trainable tubes at the stern. Additionally, the stern had 2 fixed 15.7-inch torpedo tubes. In total, the submarine could carry 13 torpedoes. On the forward deck, she mounted a 3.9-inch Model 1925 gun with a combat load of 100 rounds, and aft, there was a twin anti-aircraft mount equipped with half-inch Hotchkiss Model 1929 machine guns. Shortly after being commissioned on February 22, 1932, the boat suffered its first major incident. On January 5, 1933, while the submarine was in dry dock for repairs in Toulon, an explosion ripped through the battery compartment and sparked a fire. The crew quickly put out the flames on their own, keeping material damage to a minimum. However, 3 sailors suffered burns. Chief Electrician Jean Richoux was seriously injured, while Quartermaster Noel Maurice and Electrician Guy Rollet sustained lighter injuries. Since the damage was minor, repairs were finished without delay, and the Fresnel returned to active duty that same year. In late 1933 and 1934, the submarine departed on a scientific expedition to the northwestern Mediterranean Sea to measure changes in gravity. On board was Pierre Marty, the chief hydrographic engineer of the Central Hydrographic Service of the French Navy. During a series of dives, he took 30 measurements using equipment partially borrowed from the Dutch geophysicist Felix Andries Vinding-Minnes. This deployment made an important contribution to early oceanographic research of gravity anomalies in that region. The use of a submarine was essential to the method. Surface ships rolled and pitched with the waves. This motion could easily overwhelm the extremely small variations being measured by a pendulum apparatus. But below the surface, wave-induced movement was greatly reduced, allowing the instrument to record much more stable observations. Vinding-Minnes pioneered a system using multiple pendulums. Their motions could be compared to separate the effect of the vessel's movement from the local gravitational signal. The dives of the Fresnel turned a combat submarine into a scientific platform. This helped extend gravity mapping from land into the open sea, where such measurements were still technically difficult during the early 1930s. Throughout the mid-1930s, Fresnel engaged in routine patrols and training exercises across the Mediterranean. The crew sharpened their skills in submerged operations and tactical maneuvers as part of the 3rd Submarine Division of the French Navy, based out of Toulon. These activities were aimed at maintaining readiness amidst growing interwar tensions. On June 5, 1937, a major reorganization of French submarine forces was enacted by ministerial decree. It stressed enhanced endurance training for crews and equipment, preparing for extended deployments. Fresnel was assigned to this initiative, alongside submarines like Beauvizier, Augusta, and Acheron. Together, they underwent preparations to improve their long-duration operational capabilities. Although a cruise to Argentina was planned in 1937 as part of the reorganization, Fresnel instead departed Toulon on October 20, 1937, for a deployment to French Indochina. She arrived in December and served until April 1938. The submarine returned to Toulon on June 7, 1938. After that, she conducted patrols in North Africa, the Canary Islands, Tunisia, and West Africa through 1939. These operations demonstrated the long-range capabilities of the Redoutable-class submarines and supported the French naval presence in colonial waters. A deployment of this scale placed huge demands on every part of the boat. The diesel engines had to sustain long surface passages, while batteries and electric motors had to remain ready for repeated dives. At the same time, the crew had to preserve torpedoes, provisions, lubricants, and spare parts far from the submarine's normal support facilities. The voyage also provided the Navy with practical information that simply could not be gained during short exercises near Toulon. It tested navigation across distant waters, maintenance under tropical conditions, and the crew's ability to maintain an operational routine over many months. Strategically, Fresnel demonstrated exactly why France had invested in large ocean-going submarines rather than relying solely on coastal boats. When World War II broke out in September 1939, the French submarine Fresnel was assigned to the 3rd Submarine Division based at Toulon. This was part of the French Navy's efforts to enforce a blockade against German commerce. The vessel conducted patrols off the Canary Islands, targeting suspected German supply ships and blockade runners that had sought refuge in neutral Spanish ports. This coordinated with Allied naval strategy to stop Axis merchant traffic in the Atlantic. These operations emphasized surveillance and interception, strictly adhering to international rules like the London Naval Treaty. This treaty required submarines to announce their presence and allow crew evacuation before engaging merchant vessels. In December 1939, the submarine Fresnel joined its sister ships Acheron, Redoutable, and Leheros in the central Atlantic. They launched a search operation, hunting for the German tanker Altmark, which was supplying the pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee and carrying British prisoners. The submarines swept their assigned sectors but could not find Altmark, which evaded capture and headed for Norway. During this mission, Fresnel refueled in Casablanca to extend its cruising range. On December 29, 1939, while patrolling near the Canary Islands, Fresnel intercepted the British steamer Highland Patriot, mistaking it for a German blockade runner. The submarine fired a warning shot to stop the steamer. After a boarding party verified the ship was British, it was released unharmed. Earlier during this same patrol, Fresnel had stopped the Portuguese steamer Nyassa and captured several German citizens suspected of sabotage. In February 1940, Fresnel relocated to Casablanca in French Morocco. This was part of the 3rd Submarine Division's redeployment to maintain pressure on German shipping routes near the Canary and Azores Islands. Later that spring, as the Battle of France intensified, the submarine moved to Bizerte in Tunisia to reinforce Mediterranean defenses. On June 10, 1940, after Italy declared war, Fresnel patrolled the Tunisian coast and areas south of Sardinia alongside the submarines Le Toulon, Redoutable, and Vengeur. They were tasked with countering potential Italian amphibious landings or naval attacks, though no enemy contact led to combat. These efforts were part of a desperate attempt by the French fleet to protect its North African territories during the final stages of the campaign. On June 25, 1940, Fresnel was recalled to port following the Franco-German armistice on June 22 and the Franco-Italian agreement on June 24. This ended its active operations on the Allied side. After the armistice, the French submarine Fresnel was based in Toulon under the control of the Vichy government. There it underwent maintenance and testing in a state of limited readiness due to fuel and operational restrictions imposed by the armistice terms. On April 16, 1941, Fresnel transferred to Casablanca along with the submarines Action and Henri Poincaré. This was part of the Vichy government's efforts to redeploy naval forces in North Africa for defensive purposes. From April 22 to April 29, 1941, Fresnel conducted a training cruise along the Moroccan coast, stopping at the ports of Safi, Agadir, and Mogador, which is now called Essaouira. The crew honed their skills and tested systems under Vichy supervision, reflecting the regime's policy to maintain limited combat readiness without offensive deployments. On January 1, 1942, the submarine was officially assigned to the 5th Submarine Division in Casablanca, where it carried out non-combat duties amid rising tensions in the Mediterranean theater of operations. Later, in September and October 1942, Fresnel moved to Fadala, now the city of Mohammedia. This brought the boat closer to potential hotspots as Allied invasion preparations became increasingly active. In response to Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa on November 8, 1942, Fresnel, which was based in the Algerian city of Oran at the time, put to sea to intercept British forces. The submarine tried to torpedo the cruiser Jamaica, but fired prematurely and missed. Jamaica evaded the strike and counterattacked with depth charges, forcing Fresnel into prolonged maneuvers to avoid destruction. Pursued all the way into Spanish territorial waters, the submarine successfully escaped and arrived in Toulon on November 13, 1942. On November 27, 1942, when German and Italian forces occupied Toulon during Operation Lila to seize the Vichy fleet, the crew scuttled Fresnel in a dry dock. This was done to prevent the submarine from being captured and keep it from being used against the Allies. The massive size of the fleet off Oran made the escape of the submarine Fresnel truly remarkable. HMS Jamaica was just one part of the Center Naval Task Force, which also included the battleship HMS Rodney, aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, escort ships, and minesweepers. While her sister submarine Action was found and sunk within hours of leaving Oran, Fresnel survived repeated depth charge attacks for about 3 days. She managed to break contact and arrived in Toulon on November 13th. However, making it back didn't mean she was ready for action. She desperately needed a major overhaul and was sitting in the Mississippi Basin, completely unprepared to escape when German forces entered Toulon 2 weeks later. On November 27, 1942, the French crew intentionally scuttled Fresnel in Toulon to keep her out of enemy hands during the German occupation of Vichy France. Despite this, Axis forces seized the submarine. The Germans first took control of the wreck, but soon handed it over to their Italian allies. The Italians raised Fresnel from the water between January 28 and 29, 1943, hoping to repair her for their own navy. But because of severe resource shortages and heavy damage to the vessel, no real repairs ever happened. Then, on February 19, 1943, Poor sealing caused Fresnel to sink all over again. Italian salvage teams managed to raise her one more time on May 4th, 1943. By this point, she was completely unfit for the sea. Sitting as a dead hull meant only for scrap or training. When Italy signed an armistice with the Allies on September 9th, 1943, German forces took over Toulon and all the remaining ships. They added Fresnel to their inventory, but never bothered to make her operational again. These repeated salvage attempts didn't mean the submarine was back in action. Raising a sunken vessel just gets the hull above water so it can be inspected or moved. Repairing a sabotaged submarine takes much more than just pumping out the water. Seawater and deliberate destruction had completely ruined the electrical cables, batteries, motors, controls, and instruments. Fresnel's second sinking in February 1943 proved just how poorly the first recovery had gone. Even after being raised again in May, the Axis powers never returned her to active duty, leaving the hull exposed in Toulon's crowded naval yards. The story of the Fresnel under Axis control came to an end on March 11, 1944. During a massive bombing raid on Toulon, Allied aircraft permanently destroyed the submarine, along with other scuttled French submarines like the Redoutable and the Pascal. After the war, the wreck was finally salvaged in 1946, pulled onto the beach, and scrapped right there with no casualties recorded.